So 9 minutes.
Okay, so let's start. So all of you know Noah, but for you that you don't know him, so Noah is professor at Tel Aviv University, and he's a senior researcher with many years behind of traveling, knowing, and working in science. He has a wide range of interests that go from looking for isolated galaxies in the universe, in the cosmic web, to thinking about archeoastronomy or working on the solar system bodies and early solar system, etc. So today he will talk about archeoastronomy, and I'm sure that is going to be a very interesting talk.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ines. But I'm glad to talk about a subject that is very interesting to me and on which I did not work.
Okay.
So I read a lot about it. I talked to people. I went to meetings, but I did not do any active research in this field. But I think it's very interesting because when we live in an age like ours, when we always think about the future and the instruments that we are going to build and how we are going to explore the universe, we should always remember where we are coming from, what was before us, and have a good understanding about people in ancient times, because generally people who are thinking about antiquity think that, okay, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, people were stupid. They're just a little bit more than apes, that they started to walk on 2 feet and they were hunting and doing things. And I think that I'm going to convince you that this is a wrong attitude, and that the people were at least as smart as we are now. And this archaeoastronomy interest started when I was a fellow at an institute in Marseille, and I visited some ancient sites there in the surroundings, megaliths like these ones. I guess you are recognizing Stonehenge, to try to get a feeling of how people were doing things in antiquities. And here is this talk will essentially show you various things that have been associated with astronomy, early knowledge of the sky, and the things that I'm going to show here are mostly artifacts, not stories, because there's a different branch of archaeoastronomy that tries to analyze oral traditions of people that have been maintained for many years, and try to understand what is the connection between this and astronomy. I will mention a little bit about this too, but this is not the main thrust. The main idea here are the actual artifacts and things that people find and identify as astronomy. So this is Stonehenge. This the central part of Stonehenge. The vertical pillars, the horizontal things. These are huge stones. The 3 tons. These three stones, each one is many tons in weight, and they were quarried not on site but from a different location. They were moved to Stonehenge by people doing hard work. And Stonehenge, since the 1970s, has been identified as an early solar and lunar observatory. Most of the work was done by Tom in England, and he explained by doing very accurate measurements of the locations of various stones and features in the surroundings. He explained that people at that time, it was about 3000 BC, were using alignments, using lines of sight towards the certain points on the horizon where the sun, the moon, and special stars were rising or setting, and they were using this information as a means of keeping the calendar, as a means of predicting various events like eclipses. And this implies that 3000 BC, people had already some advanced knowledge about how things work in the sky. Uh, Here is another megalithic site that is in northern Israel, and I visited this one. There are circles of stones. The outer one is 120 meters in diameter. There are different circles. These have been destroyed during the millennia. This again dates from about 2000 to 3000 BC. In the center, there's a tumulus. There's a pile of stones that is about 5 meters high. And at the center, at the bottom of the tumulus, there's a tomb. The tomb has been excavated. No human remains were found, but some artifacts dating from the early Bronze Age were found there. The important thing about this site that is called Rujam and Hiri is that the circles have openings, have kinds of have locations where the walls are not complete. And these openings point towards the rising and the setting points of the sun in this location. This is a very flat area, as you can see. It's on the Golan Heights on a plateau. So the horizon is very clear, and there are no important landmarks in the neighborhood towards the northeast to southeast and northwest to southwest. In the north part of it, a mountain that is about 2.5 kilometers high, and this is also another sight line that may have been used at that time. The location of this site is in the northern part of Israel, about here. And in the Middle East, there are other things that can be identified as early observatories using this kind of sight line. The way that this works is that one fixes a location from which the observation is being done, and also marks on the horizon various prominent stones or bushes or pillars or whatever. Then this person will look for the rising path of a celestial body like the sun or the moon or some bright stars, and the same with settings. And these are very important because they allow people to mark the time, as I will explain shortly, and when they do not have mechanisms. But I hope that you have heard about the Antikythera mechanism. That is one of the wonders of the ancient world. This was found at the beginning of the 20th century in a sunken ship off the coast of the Antikythera island. The ship sank at about 150 BC or so, and the divers that were diving there for sponges, for sea sponges, noted some pieces of rock that had some metal embedded in the rock. These were brought to the surface and were studied, and are continuously being studied. In fact, there is a new diving expedition there to try to find even more remains, even more pieces of this. The nice thing about the Antikythera mechanism is that it has geared wheels. So it's a kind of transmission mechanism that changes the way that a rotating lever moves everything. And then there are dials that have been reconstructed using all these fragments. And these dials correspond to the bright planets that are visible. You could probably see the names: Aries, Aphrodite, that is Venus, Kronos is Saturn, Zeus is Jupiter. So they will indicate the positions of the bright planets, the sun and the moon, for any date you want, because this lever that one uses on the side of the machine can be turned and can be adjusted to whatever date you want. to see these things. The news that came out this week were that by using a special X-ray machine, they managed to decipher some writing on the one of the pieces of the machinery that is something like a user's manual. These are very small letters. They're about 1 to 1.5 millimeters high, and you need very good X-ray resolution to be able to see this. I think that the archaeologists are working on deciphering all these writings. The thing that I read is that it is clear that the writing was done by two different persons. Probably the style has changed from one part of the text to the other, but the text is not yet available to the general public. Right, so let's talk a little bit about how civilization started as far as we understand today. Most of the people will agree that civilization started in this part of the world. The Nile Valley, the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, and these regions were places where civilization started. And from these locations, civilization spread outwards by encompassing first Europe to Asia, and then the entire world. Now, why did this happen? Why did the civilization start here? We had a discussion, Anna, Ines, and I, about human migrations. We understand that the first hominids came from this region in Kenya, and then they traveled northwards, some traveled southwards, and they formed the ones that went south are the native original Bushman population of South Africa, Namibia. The part that went north spread either eastwards and northwards or westwards. Remember that about 5,000, 10,000 BC, Sahara was not a desert. Sahara was very fertile. And in fact, there are petroglyphs, scratches on rocks in North Africa that indicate a sizable population and thriving using agriculture, a little bit agriculture, but mostly gatherers of food and maybe herding some animals. We'll discuss this a little bit later. But in this region of the Fertile Crescent, this is the part of the world where a lot of things happened at around 10,000 BC. And from there, the civilization spread in various directions. The reason for this was the climate. See, the climate keeps changing. And in order to have an advanced civilization, you have to have an economy that is able to sustain these people that do not immediately produce food. They would be called priests in early times. They would be called scientists in our time. So having the proper climate with an assured water supply and a good climate conditions, they can grow food if they know about agriculture. Now, a thing that is good to know is that in the last decades, people have tried to trace the origins of, for instance, the wheat that we are eating. And the wheat was domestic wild grass here in eastern and southern parts of Turkey. And we'll come to this towards the end because this is a very important point. If you're able to control your food supply, then you become sedentary. You stay in one place, you build villages and then cities, and then you can have this extra population that will deal with science and religion. Otherwise, if you could keep moving around, it's very difficult to have this tradition. So we have the development of agriculture with the various cycles when there is a good weather, a good location. A, so you can stop following the wild animal herds that provide your food, and you can start domesticating animals, domesticating plants, and assuring your food supply this way. This probably was the reason why Egypt became so powerful an empire so early in the human development, because by about 3200 BC, we have the first dynasty of pharaohs, the first pharaoh in the Nile Valley, because in the Nile Valley there is a steady supply of water, and the climate is good to have a number of crops every year. So good years you have a lot of food, because the Nile, even though it flows all the time, some months of the year it is low. The water supply is not sufficient. But then, when the snows melt on the mountains in Central Africa, you have a flood. The Nile goes up and floods the regions on both sides of the Nile Valley. And this material that is coming with the flood is very good for agriculture. It's very nutritious for the plants. So it was very important for the early Egyptians that started using agriculture in this part to be able to predict when the Nile flood will come, because by knowing when the flood will come, they could plant the seeds in the ground that will be flooded later on, and assure themselves of a good supply of wheat, corn, not corn, but wheat and other products that they use. Now, the way that they found at about 3,500 BC to predict the flood Nile or flooding of the Nile was something called the heliacal rising of Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky, and when you see Sirius coming up from the horizon into the night sky, immediately after the sun is starting to rise, you see the sun is coming up here, and you see, the sun is here, Sirius is here. If Sirius rises together with the sun, then you know that a few weeks afterwards, the Nile flood will start. So Sirius was a very important star for the Egyptians, because by observing this phenomenon of heliacal rising, they could predict the Nile floods. Now, this does not happen every night, because as the Earth moves around the sun, the rising of Sirius can be either earlier than the sunrise or later than the sunrise. There's just one day of the year when this happens, and Sirius is coming up from the underworld, as the Egyptians believe, and it starts shining in the night sky for a little bit, because later on the light from the sun will blank everything out. So this is what the early Egyptians were using to set the calendar on. And they were using sight lines towards the direction of Sirius, looking for Sirius either showing up between two stones, very distant from the location of the person who was doing the observations, or using a similar method using wooden rods. So here's an ancient Egyptian palette that shows you a star between the horns of a cow. Now, the cows and the bulls were very important for the Egyptian economy, and by seeing this kind of image with the star between the horns, this is more like looking at a star through a sight, a rifle sight that has two blades on two sides. So this may be the way that they were looking for this heliacal rising, because you have to know where Sirius will appear from the horizon. So you look in this direction, when you see the star coming up, you know that you're here. So Sirius was connected with Osiris, one of the gods of ancient Egypt. Osiris died and revived, as other stories in other religions believe. In fact, Osiris was cut into something like 70 pieces, and pieces were put together to revive him. So Osiris and Sirius are very similar in the Egyptian pantheon, and the people in Egypt did not rely only on the heliacal rising of Sirius. They had some instrument called a nilometer, which is essentially a well that corresponds, the water level in that well corresponds to the water level of the Nile. In this nilometer, there are various gradations. So people will look there and will see the Nile is starting to rise. They will know that it's coming, the flood is coming. And the flood is quite high. Nile grows by a sizable level, so it is able to flood regions that are a kilometer across on both sides. Now, this connection between the cow god called Hathor and Sirius is also exhibited on this this thing that is a planisphere, a map of the sky of the constellations, essentially. And here is a cow with a star between its horns. This is Sirius. The Egyptian constellations did not correspond exactly to the constellations that we now have. Some constellations are identical, others are very different. But the cow, we don't have it as a constellation. The cow is considered to represent Hathor, that goddess, Egyptian goddess, and the star would be Sirius in this case, shining between the two horns. The pyramids were built about 2,200, something like this, BC. So this was not during one of the early dynasties. This was about 1,000 years after the Egyptian dynasties were established, and the pyramids are huge. If you never saw them, I recommend to go to Egypt and visit, because they are amazing. They and the Sphinx are really amazing. And there are many pyramids, and people know only about the three great pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Nefertari. But there are tens of pyramids, smaller pyramids, and step pyramids, and whatever. You know that they were used to hide, to protect the tomb of the pharaoh, the king. The pyramids in Giza are well aligned with the north-south direction. And the question that people have asked is, how did they do this? How did they manage to know which way is north and align the sides of the pyramid so precisely? So one of the possibilities is that they used a vertical line, a plumb line, that would indicate a vertical direction. And then they were looking at circumpolar stars, stars in the Small Bear and the Ursa Minor, and stars in the Ursa Major, and they were looking for this line to be parallel with the vertical as defined by a plumb line. And this indicated, if this happened, this indicated a true north. Now, this is okay, but it doesn't work at all times because of the precession. The Earth's axis is precessing, so this method will work only for a limited period of time, and this corresponds exactly to the period when the Great Pyramids were built. In fact, if you look at the orientation of later pyramids, you see that they are not so well aligned with the north-south direction. So it means that they were still using that method, but not noticing that it's deviating from the real known direction. This is a reference if one wants to read the astronomical. In Egypt, there are many temples, and these temples are oriented interestingly. Sometimes they are oriented in a way that will let the sunlight during the solstices. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year, and the summer is the longest one, the longest day of the year. The great temple at Karnak has its main axis oriented in this way, so you get this. You can see the sunrise at the winter solstice exactly to the main axis of the temple, lighting to the end of this long corridor. And this has been studied by Juan Belmonte from the Canary Islands. And in fact, he did a survey of Egyptian temples, and he showed that this orientation does not always happen. Sometimes the temples are oriented so that the main axis is towards the Nile. Sometimes there are astronomical orientations towards the east. So there was some kind of knowledge about this. This is a different a claim by a French astronomer that has to do with the zodiacal light. The zodiacal light is light scattered by dust near Earth orbit, and the light always shines in the direction of the ecliptic. This is the ecliptic plane. You can see the zodiacal light either a little bit before sunrise or a little bit after sunset in the direction of the sun. Where the sun has risen or has set, you see this cone of light. Now, this French astronomer noticed that the crown of the pharaoh, as depicted on different monuments, has a different inclination depending on the geographical location. And he calculated that this corresponds exactly to the zodiacal light angle to the horizon, which is interesting. So this and Pharaoh was a god. He had to have some connection with celestial phenomena. So here is a link that will demonstrate to the people that the Pharaoh is a true god. Then there is this thing that is a victory stele, a big stone with this person, the king, killing some people and being very victorious, and a kind of conical mountain with two stars above it. Now, the interpretation of this, here is a simulation. This is sunset, a zodiacal light, and the planets Jupiter and Venus, as seen on this date, at this time, from this place in the close to the Iran-Iraq, present-day Iran-Iraq border. Now, we know that around this time, there was a big battle between King Naram Sin and some tribes, and we know from various historical records that he was victorious. And the place of the battle was not far from this location. So here you have another depiction of the king being victorious because these two stars are shining above the zodiacal light, which would interpret some kind of astronomical knowledge, or at least paying notice to what is happening in the sky. That was 2000 BC. Going further back, about 5000 BC, there's this location called Nabta in the south part of Egypt, about here, where circles of stones have been discovered, in standing stones. These are not as big as a Stonehenge, but they are also much earlier. This is about 5000 BC. These circles of stone again indicate some directions, preferential directions, and this paper, Malville and colleagues, they've studied this site, and they say that this may also have been a kind of astronomical observatory. They found there burial places of people and burial places of animals as well, and alignments with stones that were much more distant, hundreds of meters away, that pointed towards the direction of Sirius rising, for instance. See, this is 4000 and something BC, which is at least 1000 years before the first pharaoh that was in Egypt. Now, what kind of people were living in this place? This, remember that I said that at that time, Sahara was still fertile, so the people believed that herds of cattle were moving from place to place, and these people were maybe moving the herds of cattle from Sahara to the Nile and back maybe. This is why there are many burial locations of cattle also. So the proto-Egyptians that did not yet have a kingdom were starting some kind of agriculture, animal husbandry, and they needed to be able to see the maybe the heliacal rising of Sirius to know when the water would be in the Nile. But Sirius was important to them as well. Now we are jumping to about 1600 BC. Nebra is a place in Germany where some hooligans did some unauthorized archaeological digs, and they found this piece, which is a copper disc with inlaid gold decorations. They tried to sell this on the market, and they were caught. This was confiscated by the archaeologists who asked the thieves to take them to the place where they found this, and they started some normal digs, and they found a sword and other remains from and pieces of carbon with which they could date this thing at about 1600 or so. Now, the interpretation of the Nebra disk is interesting because what you see are these things that are to be taken as stars. There's the sun, the moon, this thing here and this thing here. It is clear that the disk is not complete. There are parts missing. And probably when it was reconstructed as it should have been, there were two segments here, one here and one here, and these things. And the way that people explain this is that indeed we have the sun and the moon, and we have the arc of the setting locations and the rising locations of the sun as it is during the year, because you know that in the summer the sun rises north of the equator, of the east direction, and sets north of the west direction. So you have an angle from the shortest day, longest day of the year to the shortest day of the year, which is the arc that the sun rising and setting locations are changing along it during the year. And then people have questioned, what does this mean? And some people have suggested that this is a sun god. The Egyptians, next to the pyramids, they also buried some boats that are called sun boats. They believe that the sun is traveling through the sky on a boat, on a kind of boat. The stars are not identified except that these are thought to represent the Pleiades, the open star cluster, which has bright stars in it. So people will notice it as a concentration of stars. 3,000 years earlier, again in Germany, there was something like a Stonehenge thing. It's called the Gothic Circle. It dates from about 5000 BC. And the circle was found as a set of holes in the ground that had remains of wooden pillars that were there. This is the reconstruction. Concentric circles with openings towards the sunset and sunrise at the winter solstice. Winter solstice is very important because this is the time when the weather changes from being very cold to start to get hotter, and closer to the renewal of spring and everything else. So it is important to observe the sun at these locations because this can, again, reset your calendar. You don't have any other means except astronomy if you don't have clocks. So a Gothic circle is not unique. I can tell you that there are hundreds of such circles in the region of Germany and Poland. Most of them have been discovered by satellite imagery, but they have not been investigated yet. So here's an opening for people who want to do this. And then we have cave paintings that have been also interpreted as indicating some astronomical connections. These date from the Paleolithic time, tens of thousands of years ago. For instance, the Cueva del Castillo, okay, which is the north part of Spain. I think it's something like 60 kilometers west of Bilbao. And there are many paintings of hands there. But there's this one that has also this kind of semicircle of dots. And somebody interpreted this as being the Corona Borealis constellation, that again has a kind of semicircular. In Lascaux, there are these dots above one of the bulls, and somebody interpreted them as again being the Pleiades. Because maybe, but you see that the evidence is hard to explain. There is a place in Peru called Chanquillo that has this kind of strange constructions on top of a ridge of mountains. This was investigated, and the people who did the investigation proposed that this is a sun and moon observatory. There are 13 such blocks, and by looking through them, you get an idea from a certain location. You get an idea about the position of the sun and the moon, and from this you can predict eclipses again, either of the sun or of the moon. So Chanquillo is much later. Chanquillo dates from about 300 BC, but things developed at a different rate in the Americas. Now, okay, how about the east part of the world? In Korea, there are a number of megalithic constructions like this dolmen, and in some cases, on the dolmen you see sets of holes that are interpreted as representing stars in constellations. These are dating from about 3000 BC. The orientation of the dolmens has been studied in a PhD thesis, and the orientation is not astronomical. The major axes of the dolmens are aligned according to topographic directions, like ridges or so. But the holes on the dolmen would definitely indicate Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and other Taurus stellar constellations. This again about 3000 BC. Here's Ursa Major on, on, on this rock. So okay, let's summarize more or less what I talked about now. I explained about Stonehenge, 8000 BC. I explained about Gosek, about 5000 BC, about the same time as Nabta in Egypt. I explained about the Antikythera, a computer essentially, that is much more modern. And in fact, it represents one of the first applications of gears that essentially built the modern civilization. Nebradisk, somewhere in between, Chankilo much later. So the question is, was there one location from which all these things started, all this thinking about the world, the sky started, and this idea spread all over the world? Or were these independent discoveries at different places? We know that there has been communication between people. And last week, when I was in Brussels, I discussed with some Austrian colleagues Utsi. Utsi is a frozen, petrified person that apparently he was wandering from different places, and he had on him some artifacts that definitely did not belong to that part of the world. It came from, and Utsi is 5000 BC. So, okay, so we'll now go a little further back, earlier in time, at two locations that date much earlier than anything we've seen until now. One is Jericho, and the other one is in Turkey, it's called Göbekli. Jericho has been investigated by Kathleen Kenyon in about 100 years, less than 100 years ago. And what she found there was very interesting. She found the remains of a tower. Jericho was a city that was encircled by a wall, like a protective wall. And if you read your Bible, you know that Joshua, with the Israelites, came and conquered Jericho by blowing trumpets that caused the walls to fall. But that was much later. The Battle of Jericho with Joshua was maybe 2000 BC or something like this, maybe later. Here we are talking about remains that date from about 8000 BC, between 8000 to 7000 BC. The tower is very interesting because from the interpretations of modern archaeologists, it could not have been a defense tower. The reason for not considering it as a defense tower was that the tower was inside the walls, not outside the walls. So normally, when you want to have a tower to protect the city, wanted to protect the walls. The tower is before the wall. But this was inside the city, just touching the wall. Another interesting thing about this tower is that it has a staircase in it. It's one of the very earliest staircases known. The staircase is very steep, about that angle. It's very difficult to climb. In fact, you have to climb on feet and hands to go up there. And when you are at the top of the tower, you're facing east. And next to the town of Jericho, the historic settlement of Jericho, there is a small mountain. It's called the Karantal, which is about 1 kilometer, a little more than 1 kilometer away from the tower, but much higher than it. So here is Jericho, the West Bank. I can't go now to Jericho because Israelis are forbidden to go there. It's in a Palestinian territory, fully Palestinian territory. The town is here, the old town is here, and this is a tower. The Neolithic tower is here. Karantal is to the west of Jericho, and the archaeologists who studied it, this is how the mountain looks like. They found that on a certain date of the year, the setting sun will just go tangentially along the side of the mountain. And this, of course, is the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. So on the summer solstice, the sun will go down along this thing, not touching it or not going behind it at any moment. But on any other date, it will not happen. Only on this date it will happen. And on this date, the shadow of the mountain will first cover the tower, and then it will cover the old city. This is a simulation, and this is a paper if you want to read it. Now, what was the reason then to build the tower? The reason to build the tower was be able to tell the people of the city, okay, this is the date when the sun is going tangential to the mountain, and from this date on, we'll have a new year or something like this. So this kind of knowledge was very important for the people who wanted power, because they could tell the king of the city and the population that, okay, we have renewed everything, and we have the promise of good life and everything. I must also add that there are other reasons why this was not a defense tower or a protection tower, because the archaeologists could not identify any hostile population living in that neighborhood and at that time. And they could also rule out possible damages by flood, because sometimes floods have happened, and this tower would not have been protecting the walls over. So here you are with Jericho, here, and from Jericho, it's at Ericha here. We are going to go here to Gobekli. This is a very, very interesting site that has been investigated by a German archaeologist who died 2 years ago, unfortunately. This is Gobekli Tepe. It's a really amazing site. All these structures were buried, and they were discovered by chance because an archaeologist who went to this site saw one of the tops of the rocks protruding from the mountain, reported it, but did not do any archaeological work there. And then the German Archaeological Survey took this as a challenge, and for the last 30 years, they've been working on this site and discovering newer and more interesting things. The specific of Göbekli Tepe are these round structures of vertical pillars that are about 3 to 5 meters high each. And they cannot be identified as houses. In fact, the whole site cannot be identified as a village or a location where people were living continuously. The interpretation is that this was a site that was used only for some ceremonial work. The population was coming to this place, was actually not migrating, but a kind of pilgrimage to this site, spending some time here, and then they were going away. Göbekli Tepe was started probably between 11,000 and 12,000 years ago. And about 8,000 years ago, it was deliberately abandoned. Not only it was abandoned, but it was completely covered with rubbish. So the archaeologists were digging through these rubbish mounds and finding these vertical stones that are very interesting. This is how the site looks. Show you some more pictures of this. See these structures. I think that by now there are 13 structures, round structures like this. But it is known that there are tens more that were deliberately left alone Schmidt, the archaeologist who ran this exploration for almost 30 years, he wrote a book about Göbekli Tepe. The book exists, as far as I know, only in German and in Italian. The book is called They Built the First Temple. Um, the site is now being only maintained so it will not deteriorate, and is being developed for people to be able to come and visit normally. It's in a region that is not so healthy to go because southeast of Turkey is a troubled region now. But maybe in the future it will be possible to go. This is how these things look from above. Sometimes you have these two pillars, two central pillars, and pillars around. And again, it was not clear whether there was some kind of covering, a roof or anything, or whether these were completely open to the sky. When I asked Schmidt for detailed maps of the site to check for alignments, he did not give me anything. And the things are probably in the archive of the German Archaeological Survey, but they are not accessible to the public. This is again an interesting thing that has various pieces of rock lying. These are the two main pillars and the pillars around the circumference. This looks like a window, some door. Both. It's hard to understand these structures because there's nothing written about them and no oral legends that will explain. There are these holes at the top of the pillars that are also unexplained to me. And then Belmonte went to visit this site and he found these two stones interpreted as showing constellations. He said, okay, this is Scorpio and this is Leo. Now, maybe, but here is a paper that was published, and so now we come to the conclusion part of this talk. My conclusions are that it is hard to say whether a astronomical interest has been developed in parallel at different sites. Would be much easier to believe that everything started in the Fertile Crescent in the region of Göbekli Tepe. That region in the southeast of Turkey is the region I told you where grain was first domesticated, about 12,000 BC. Animals were first domesticated, like pigs and goats, and this is known from the remains of these animals. So it is possible that what we saw here is a transition in Göbekli Tepe, a transition between the nomad society to stationary populations building villages when they did not need this central cultural point. In nomad populations, there are always these gathering places where tribes come and have a feast together. They eat, they marry from different tribes to keep the genetic diversity. And this is known, for instance, from American Indians that have this kind of civilization. But it would be possible to think that, say, at about 10,000 BC, some kind of interest started in the region of Jericho, Göbekli Tepe, Cyprus. I did not mention Cyprus, but in Cyprus there are also Neolithic villages that have these round structures that look very similar to the Göbekli Tepe structures. And remember that at 8,000 or so years ago, Cyprus was linked by a land bridge to the mainland. The sea level was lower. So it is possible that all this started in the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean, and from there it spread all over the world. going to Peru via the first Vikings or the Indians that crossed from Siberia into the Americas about 20,000 BC. But it's difficult to pin down this conclusion because you hit various statements. Like, for instance, there's a short paper by a person called Om. It was published in 1901. He has studied legends of the Bedouins in the Sinai. Now, the Bedouins, he reports, have a special name for Sirius. This name can be translated the one that has passed across. Now, what could do Sirius to pass across? If you look at the proper motion of Sirius as it is seen from the Earth, from the solar system, it is now on one side of the Milky Way, but 70,000 years ago it was on the other side of the Milky Way. So if you believe that this represents some kind of ancient memory of where the bright star was and how it moved across the Milky Way, then you can say, okay, astronomical interest started 70,000 years ago. But it's hard to believe this. I mean, I would rather have things like Gianchilo and the work of Tom with the Stonehenge and other alignments to base my conclusions on. For instance, there's a guy who claims that in some place in Romania, there was also a kind of astronomical observatory about the turn of the century, between 100 BC to 100 AD. The problem is, he's basing this because there's a huge round stone there with markings on it. The problem is that this stone is in a valley. It's not on a location where you can see the horizon. The horizon is blocked by mountains all around. Anyway, so it may be that it was like that. It may be that it was some of that. Until somebody invents a time machine that will allow us to go back in time and see how things really were, we have to make our own conclusions. But not only the archaeologists and the scientists who do archeoastronomy are very ingenious, but also the people in ancient times were ingenious, intelligent, could draw logical conclusions and could combine observations taken over long times. And I'm waking up early in the morning and I'm looking at the sun that has not yet risen, and I notice how the sun is moving north and south with the seasons. So if I do this, then they can do this as well. The brain did not change so much in the last 10 or 20,000 years. So this is my conclusion. And if anyone wants to go into this field, it will be interesting.
So let's thank Then is one of you to run the light?